It's often considered to be a third rail issue, kind of politically toxic. I'm guessing this seems like a friendly crowd, so a lot of you who might already agree that we might need to do some reform on parking, we're going to give you some details and some evidence and anecdotes that you can use to convince other people. And if parking reform makes you a little anxious, hopefully we'll give you some information that will convince you that it's okay and you should support reforms everywhere and here in Port Townsend. Our experience is that in general, most people are a little unaware of kind of the impact of too much parking, and they're generally surprised when they find out how expensive it is and how arbitrary these mandates that have led to the amount of parking we have are. But parking reforms are sweeping the nation, and the evidence from vanguard cities that have done this is that the sky doesn't fall. And in fact, the places that we love the most, as we saw in some previous presentations, are often only possible because they were built before we had parking mandates and requirements. And a lot of those places actually haven't had parking mandates for decades. Parking is really expensive. It costs vary widely, but $30,000 to $50,000 for an above ground space is not uncommon anymore. And who pays? In the case of a grocery store, everyone pays on every transaction, no matter if you drove there or biked there or walked there. In the case of an apartment building, everyone pays as well, whether you own a car or not. Parking requirements absolutely contribute to sprawl. With those parking ratios I mentioned, if they're more than 1 for every 300 square feet, you can guarantee that the parking lot is going to be bigger than the building that it serves. And we know big lots are unpleasant to cross. They make even park once and walk difficult. They're anti-walkability. Huge percentages of our city centers are devoted to storing cars. Parking Reform Network looked at more than 50 cities recently and studied how much of their central city is parking, and the results are sobering. In Columbus, Ohio, the central city is 27% parking. In Anchorage, Alaska, it's 30% parking. And these maps don't highlight a lot of underground parking. They don't have parking that's under apartments or office buildings, and they don't include street parking. How much parking do we have in our cities? No one knows. It's too much to count. But your average city driver will tell you that we definitely need more. Let's look at Portland. It's a city widely regarded as one of the best bigger cities or mid-sized cities for walkability and biking. It's only 11% parking in the downtown. Downtown areas are likely to have less parking than commercial areas outside the city center. But a PRN member and Portland State grad student, Ryan Martin, did a study of all the land in the city limits of Portland, Oregon, and found that 20% of it was for parking. So how can only 11% of the downtown be for cars, but 20% of the total city? Because the central city was designed and largely built before 1959, when Portland adopted parking requirements. For the past 60 years, anything in Portland has looked much more like, anything built has looked much more like the area outlined in red than the area outlined in yellow. As a planner in Pasco, Washington told Katie, if we had to build off-street parking at today's standards, the entire city would be covered in asphalt. And all that asphalt and pavement is a disaster for public health and safety. Surface lots contribute significantly to urban heating. It advances the climate clock in our cities and makes summertime, nighttime temperatures intolerable. Runoff from surface lots taxes treatment plants, pollutes rivers, lakes, and streams, and contributes to urban flooding, which is a big danger for lives and property. And most of all these impacts I've mentioned are independent of whether your car runs on electricity or gasoline, or whether there's a charging station at the space where you parked. That parking influences how we get around. I ask people who are skeptical about parking reform if their city has any traffic. Do you have congestion? Because parking is a battery for traffic. And building new parking in places that already have traffic is a surefire way to just invite more noise, emissions, and traffic collisions. Requiring more parking is a surefire way to undermine your progress on climate goals and efforts to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And if parking's free, it's going to really encourage driving. A study of DC commuters found that charging anything for parking at work was twice as effective at reducing drive-alone trips than offering all transportation benefits: bike parking, subsidized bus passes, and on-site locker rooms combined. In our map study, we found that 20% of central city land, on average, among all the 51 cities we did, was dedicated to storing cars. So what could we do with that space instead? If all that land used to store cars could be used to house people at, say, the density in the Adams-Morgan neighborhood in Washington, D.C., the same 50 downtowns could provide homes for 250,000 people. So the choice is pretty simple. Do we want to have more living space or more parking space? But we shouldn't just focus on apartments and bigger buildings near transit stations. Most of our cities, including Port Townsend, are largely zoned for lower density uses. But strangely, those are the areas where parking mandates are the most sticky. They're hardest to get rid of. A single parking space on its own doesn't do anything. You need another space or more than one space at the other end of the road. So requiring more parking in your low density areas requires that the whole city is going to be more car dependent. We can build a lot of our missing middle housing in our backyards and garages, but parking requirements for 1 or 2 spaces per unit will make a lot of projects infeasible. And those that are built will include more pavement, less tree coverage, and they're going to be more expensive because of the bundled parking.
All right, where do we go from here? How do we start undoing all this damage and building our communities in a different way that's less dependent on cars? When I spoke to Jacob, that planning manager from Pasco a few months ago, he framed it in this really good way that has kind of stuck with me ever since. Pasco is growing so much that it's easy to think of building a whole nother Pasco on top of the one that's already there. Right? Which kind of invites the question, if we were going to rebuild our city from scratch, would you want to do it the same? Right? Well, our zoning codes pretty much prevent us from doing it the same as we used to. And it would look like an entirely different city. But this dynamic isn't unique to Pasco. Washington is growing across the whole state. In 1960, right, in this era where we're adopting parking requirements and changing the zoning everywhere, Washington had 2.9 million residents. And every generation since, it's added 2 million more. Another state on top of the one that's already there. And that growth isn't expected to slow. So how do we want to grow? Do you want to be on the left or the right? When you think about what we're building now, you can find what we're building now in our zoning codes. But there's a lot of places that are making this choice to grow more like they did from the past, to unburden new construction from these arbitrary requirements. And this map is maintained by the Parking Reform Network, and is referenced by cities all the time when they're making the case of why they should get rid of their own parking requirements. And each year is getting a lot easier for cities, whether you're big or small, hot or cold, lots of transit, no transit, to find peers on this map who have already done this reform, and it makes it easier for you to do so. One thing I wanted to point out here is you'll see a lot of these dots are in orange for city center districts. Why are so many city centers getting rid of parking requirements? A lot of them did them decades ago. And the simple fact is because there's so many non-conforming buildings, right? So many of your downtowns cannot legally be rebuilt with parking requirements. But that's changing. We're seeing this new movement of cities that are getting rid of all parking requirements, all uses, citywide. And contrary to what you might think, this is not a big city reform. The majority of these towns are small, right? And they're doing it because it makes a simpler zoning code that's easier for the city to administer, and it makes a clear message for developers. Please invest in Ecorse, Michigan. Right? We want your business in Seabrook, New Hampshire, or Branson, Missouri. Some of the notable additions to this chart, and we know that it's not complete. There's some cities we don't know the date exactly. Anchorage, Alaska got rid of parking requirements citywide last year. Their land area is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Also, San Jose, California got rid of parking requirements citywide last year. I think they're the biggest by population. Almost 1 million people live there. So, in the United States, yeah. And we know that this week, Portland, Oregon, and Salem, Oregon also had meetings where this is on the docket to discuss getting rid of parking requirements. And this is part of the reason I was so excited to come to Port Townsend, because this is a small city reform. And there are currently no Washington cities represented on this chart. The other big change is that we're seeing statewide reforms for the very first time. And these are coming out of the West Coast, right where we are. Last July, the State Land Use Agency in Oregon adopted this administrative rulemaking package called the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rules. It involves a lot of land use and transportation planning changes, but the biggest change that we're seeing immediate benefits from, and that's also kind of easy for people to grasp, is the parking reform. So in Oregon, they got rid of parking requirements within a half-mile of frequent transit corridors, but also not near transit for all affordable housing, for childcare facilities, for housing for people with disabilities, and there's a lot of other categories too. Small residences under 750 square feet is a big one that covers most studio and one-bedroom apartments, and this applies to all of Oregon metro areas. And then a couple months later, California followed up and they adopted AB 2097, and that prohibits cities from requiring parking within a half mile of frequent transit stations across the state. It was their third time that they've had legislation like this introduced over the last 10 years, and they finally adopted it. So we had 2 states in the same year that adopted really big statewide parking reforms. They both went into effect January 1st this year. Lots of other states have introduced similar legislation. Washington was one of them. Colorado, I mean, there's a lot of states that are looking at this and they're trying to replicate this because people know it's a problem. So what actually happens next? One of the first things I tell people to look out for is vacant buildings coming back into use. And that was the reason why these planners in Fayetteville, Arkansas got rid of their commercial parking requirements back in 2015. Right? People at the planning department know. People are calling about these properties, they're interested in developing them. What can we do here? Right? But the same ones would stay vacant year after year. So they got rid of commercial parking requirements across the city. And multiple properties are benefiting already. This building here is right on the edge of downtown, and it was vacant for over 40 years. It has 5 parking spaces in a very small little parking lot, and they only use them for employees. But what the owners really liked about this building was this wonderful view. Hartford, Connecticut has been on a mission for over a decade now to get thousands of people to move back to downtown. And their work got a lot easier when they adopted a new zoning code that got rid of all parking requirements. So they have an agency that helps fund these office to housing conversions, something that's like very hot right now in the post-COVID world. And this is one of them. So these 2 buildings, this brick with the glass, and then also this kind of tall tower on the left, these were both vacant commercial spaces, once referred to as the largest pigeon coop in Connecticut, because they're in really, really poor shape. And there's no parking on site for either of these. Now they are home to 250 apartments. And for people who have a car that want to live there, right, they set up a deal where people can park in this parking garage that's right on the same block. You see it a couple buildings down. And this is a really good, this is a win-win situation. People who don't need a parking spot don't have to pay for it, so they get cheaper rent. And that parking garage gets extra business because not as many people are driving downtown anymore, right? So this is a really good, efficient use of sharing that kind of makes a circular economy. All right, this is very exciting. We just published this information yesterday. That's how quickly things are, how quickly we're learning. There have been some really good studies about what development happens after parking becomes voluntary for people to build. So Buffalo, New York, they got rid of all their parking requirements citywide, I think in 2017. And researchers from the university looked at the 2 years of things that went through major development review, 36 projects. Seattle did a really big reform. It's still piecemeal, right? But for urban centers and near transit in 2012. And there was a much bigger sample. Almost 800 buildings over 5 years were tracked and analyzed. And both of these studies found the same thing, right? Very different cities. Seattle's growing really fast. Buffalo, half the population it did in the 1950s. Oldest housing stock in the country. they found that most new buildings in those data sets would have been illegal to build before, right? Most of the new housing in these data sets would have been illegal because they built too many homes and too few parking spots that would have been required by the previous code. So this is not a reform that affects a handful of buildings. It affects the majority of your future housing, which is a really impactful thing to think about. It's taken me a while to wrap my head around this data. In that Seattle data set I talked about, just out of this 5-year period, 2012 to 2017, researchers found that this reform legalized 35,000 new homes. That's over 9% of the city's current housing stock, right? This is a very impactful reform, especially if your city is growing. And without parking mandates, those buildings in Seattle, they ended up building 40% fewer spaces than they would have been required to before, right? Okay, so don't get scared. This isn't making a parking shortage, or maybe you're like, I've been to Seattle, they don't have enough parking. It's more appropriate to think about this as a market correction. Because that same year, 2012, researchers from King County surveyed over 200 multifamily buildings in the area. And on average, parking was oversupplied. Can I get a little demo? By 40%. The exact same number that builders chose to build less, right? They know how much parking residents need. It's easy to survey other buildings and see how much parking is needed, and they built exactly that much less. And overall, that saved the city from 18,000 parking spaces that likely never would have gotten used. But still, most new buildings still provide parking. Most people still drive. Most people expect this as an amenity. Only a small fraction of buildings choose to not provide any parking at all, even though these are the most feared among us. But this flexibility is really key, right? This flexibility allowed, this is Veronica. She lives on Capitol Hill. She just moved into her first home that she owns last month. Her building is a new condo building built by Habitat for Humanity. And it doesn't have any parking, and that's no problem for her because she's never owned a car, right? But now she has an opportunity to own a home because of the zoning reform. In Oregon, we're seeing some, I guess, early signs of who is going to be using this new flexibility. This is an affordable housing development. It's still a rendering, of course, in Troutdale, Oregon. On the very first business day that the new rules went into effect in January, Home Forward, the affordable housing developer, refiled their permits for this building. They were in a really contentious debate about this project because the city of Troutdale requires 2 parking spaces per unit, which is an extremely high requirement. Home Forward submitted studies about actual parking use at other affordable housing developments in the region and found that on average, a household uses 1.1 parking spaces, right? So there's like, here's the data of how much parking gets used, and the city said, nope, we don't want this many people living here, right? So they had to make this decision of, do we wait out for the new rules, or do we cut 25% of our housing, this area that really needs affordable housing? So they waited, they refiled. This is another project from a local architect, Gene Templeton. He revised his plans for this small apartment building. He added 4 more units because of the new flexibility. And according to him, this flexibility, it saved the project altogether from being scrapped. Because the old requirement that he was going to have to build 7 parking spots, it would have required part of this building to be punched out for a driveway, and most of it was going to have to be like on stilts, right, to build those 7 parking spaces. This is a small lot in like historic Beaverton, right? And the parking has to be in the back of the property. There's lots of rules about where and how to design your parking that also make these things difficult. So this was a really complicated building that was going to require a lot of expensive steel and concrete work to essentially cantilever the building above this parking lot. So with these, and it just wasn't penciling out, right? He was talking to his structural engineers and like was getting ready to walk away from the project, and that was when the rules were adopted in Oregon last summer. He said, great, let's redesign the building. So we took out the parking and now it's just a simple square building with more housing than before for the people who want to live there. And I love this story. This is Melissa Bruce. She operates a small residential healthcare facility for seniors who are at the end of their lives and can't care for themselves anymore. She has people living there with late-stage dementia or Parkinson's. She won like a Nurse of the Year in 2019 in Oregon. And she wanted to expand her facility from like 5 beds to 12. And even though there's like a huge shortage of places for these people to go to, the state's even offering incentives for people like her to take patients out of hospitals. The city denied her request to do the expansion over 2 parking spaces in probably the most emotional planning commission meeting I've ever watched. There was like lots of people crying. And now this type of housing has no parking requirements in Oregon. So she's starting to go through the permit process again to build this facility. Every community has stories like this, right? Every planning department I call, they know the people who are struggling to build a home, to start a business because of parking requirements. And because of this reform and all the, we're starting to accumulate these success stories, right? Of the good things that are happening when people are free from these requirements and we actually just give them the flexibility to do what they already want to do. We also know that, I mean, there's people in every planning department that really want to get rid of these rules, and they just need this critical amount of public support, which is where people come in, because parking is something that people love to complain about. And when there's like excited group of people or a really passionate public official who gets it, who wants to get rid of these rules, we're seeing like, right, this accelerated process of cities tipping over and leaving these rules in the 1950s where they belong. So thanks for listening to our presentation. I think maybe we have a couple time for questions. I'll be on the panel later. But if you want to get in touch with Tony or I, we're here this afternoon. Here's all of our contact information. We love talking about parking. We could do it all day.